Welcome to the second part of the second week of the Logic and Critical Thinking course. The topic of this unit is Contradiction and Entailment. If you recall, the topic of the previous unit was propositions. There we learned that a proposition is a sentence that can be either true or false. And we practiced identifying and analyzing propositions in a number of exercises. Contradiction and entailment are two very important logical relationships that sometimes hold between propositions, and these relationships, when they hold between propositions, allow us often to make inferences on the basis of those propositions. There are two laws about propositions that we will review now. The first is the law of excluded middle, according to which every proposition is either true or false. The second is the law of non-contradiction, according to which no proposition can be both true and false in the same sense at the same time. We need to clarify the law of non-contradiction. Recall that it said no proposition can be both true and false in the same sense at the same time. So what do we mean by in the same sense? Well, sometimes a sentence can have more than one meaning. In other words, it can be taken in more than one sense. Consider the sentence, "The passenger sat still as the jet lifted off." This sentence could be true if we take it in the sense that these passengers did not move around in the cabin while the jet was flying. But the sentence cannot be true if we take it in the sense that they did not move at all, since they were flying. Therefore, the sentence is true in one sense, or it could be true in one sense, and yet would be false in another sense. But that doesn't violate the law of non-contradiction, because that law explicitly states that no proposition can be both true and false in the same sense. And this is a proposition which is true in one sense, but false in a very different sense. It is not true and false in the same sense, and therefore it does not violate the law of non-contradiction. Also, that law said that no proposition can be both true and false at the same time. Obviously, some propositions can be true at one time and false at another time. For instance, it is raining in Doha. Most of the time, that's false. But of course, it will be true when it is raining in Doha, and then it will be false again when it stops raining. But it cannot be raining in Doha and not raining in Doha at the same time. What is a contradiction then? One proposition A contradicts another proposition B when A means directly or indirectly that B is false. For example, the earth is not flat directly contradicts that the earth is flat. The earth is spherical indirectly contradicts that the earth is flat, because of the meaning of the terms spherical and flat. Anything which is spherical can't be flat. The earth is spherical entails that the earth is not flat, which in turn directly contradicts that the earth is flat. A self-contradiction is when a proposition or set of propositions means directly or indirectly that some proposition is both true and false in the same sense at the same time. So the statement that the round table is not round is a direct self-contradiction. The statement that this round table has four corners is indirectly a self-contradiction, for the meaning of the term round includes not having four corners. So this proposition entails either that the round table is not round, or that the table without four corners has four corners. That is, either way, it entails a direct self-contradiction. Which of the following statements are self-contradictions? The analysts say we are in a recession, but the government says the economic fundamentals are sound. The world is a safer place than before because of our recent invasion of Petrostan, but we cannot withdraw because the threat to our security is greater now than it has ever been. All passengers must remain seated while we are flying. Everybody here knows what a contradiction is, but I don't. So recall, take a moment to decide which of these are self-contradictions and which are not. And in a few seconds, we'll look at the answers. Okay. The analysts say we are in a recession, but the government says the economic fundamentals are sound. Certainly, if we are in a recession, then the economic fundamentals are not sound. That's just what a recession means. However, this is not a self-contradiction because the analysts are saying one thing and it's the government that's saying another. So there's no contradiction between the fact that the analysts say we are in a recession and the government says that the economic fundamentals are sound. It just means that the analysts and the government are contradicting each other, not that this statement is a self-contradiction. This one, on the other hand, is a self-contradiction. For the world cannot be a safer place than ever before, and yet the threat to our security be greater now than it has ever been, because that's directly a self-contradiction. If the world is safer than ever before, the threat to our security must be less than it has ever been. All passengers must remain seated while we are flying. This is not a self-contradiction for the reason we just saw, that we should understand this in the sense that the passengers did not move around in the cabin while the plane was flying. Everybody here knows what a contradiction is, but I don't. Entailment. One proposition A entails another B when it is the case that A being true and B being false means directly or indirectly a self-contradiction. So this shape is a square entails that this shape is rectangular. For every square is rectangular. Co-entailment is when A both entails and is entailed by B. Not every case of entailment is co-entailment. For example, this shape is a square is not entailed by this shape is rectangular, because not every rectangle is a square. Ali is taller than Arslan is co-entailed by Arslan is shorter than Ali. They both entail each other. That's because of the meaning of taller than and shorter than. There is a logical relation between two propositions or sets of propositions when the truth value of one proposition or set affects the truth value of the other proposition or set. Contradiction and entailment are two types of logical relation. A contradicts B when the truth of A makes B false, and A entails B when the truth of A makes B true. The key terms of a logical relation are the terms in the propositions that give them the logical relation that they have. For example, the liquid in the bottle is H2O contradicts the statement that the liquid in the bottle is milk. This is because of the meaning of the terms H2O and milk. So these are the two key terms. 2 is half of 4 entails that 2 is 1/4 of 8. This is because of the meanings of all the terms. 2, half of 4, and 1/4 of 8. So all of them are key terms. Ali is taller than Arslan, and Arslan is taller than Said, entail together that Ali is taller than Said. This is because of the meaning of taller than, so this is the key term. Of course, the names Ali, Arslan, and Said have nothing to do with who is taller than who. Notice that terms like half of 4 and the liquid in the bottle can be broken down into simpler parts, like half and 4. Terms that can be broken down into simpler parts are complex terms. Other terms like half cannot be broken down into any simpler parts. Terms that cannot be broken down into simpler parts are called simple terms. To understand an idea by breaking it down to see what its parts are is called analysis. To put simpler ideas together as parts of a new, more complex idea is called synthesis. These are both important skills we will learn and practice in this course. Here are examples of the exercises for the second part of week 2. We'll go through a few to get you started so that you'll know what to do, and then you can do the rest on your own. Recall this statement was taken from the second part of the exercise for the first unit of week 2. This statement says fear of genetic discrimination already is affecting how people view the medical revolution promised by mapping the human genome. Which of the following contradicts this proposition? The way to do this is to start by asking what the question is asking us for. Which of one of the following contradicts this proposition? We already know that one proposition contradicts another, just in case the first proposition's being true makes the second one false. Therefore, we're going to look for a sentence among the list of the 4 sentences down here, which, if true, must mean that the sentence at the top is false. The sentence at the top again says that fear of genetic discrimination already is affecting how people view the medical revolution promised by mapping the human genome. So let's start A. Fear of genetic discrimination is making people happy about the medical revolution promised by mapping the human genome. Is it the case that that sentence, if true, will mean that the sentence at the top must be false? Or in other words, can both of these sentences be true at the same time? The answer to that question seems to be yes, because to make someone happy is actually to affect how people view something. So, if it in fact does make people happy about the medical revolution promised by mapping the human genome, then it is affecting how people view the medical revolution. Therefore, in fact, sentence A there entails the sentence at the top and doesn't contradict it at all. B says, fear of genetic discrimination has not yet affected how people view the medical revolution promised by mapping the human genome. So, obviously, the key difference here is that in this proposition, we have it that it has not yet affected people's view. Whereas on the top sentence, it says that it already is affecting. If something has not yet affected how people view it, then it cannot already have been affecting them. Therefore, if the sentence B is true, the sentence at the top must be false. And therefore, B contradicts the sentence at the top. So we basically have our answer. But let's go on to look at the others. C says fear of genetic discrimination is going to affect how people view the medical revolution promised by mapping the human genome. There, again, the difference is in the tense. It's future tense. Fear of genetic discrimination is going to affect how people view the medical revolution. Now, it can be the case that it is going to affect, and also the case that it already is affecting. Therefore, there's no contradiction between C and the sentence at the top. D says fear of genetic discrimination already is affecting how people view television. And that's totally irrelevant. Television is one thing, and the medical revolution promised by mapping the human genome is something different. So, it's completely possible that fear of genetic discrimination can affect how people view television and how people view the medical revolution promised by mapping the human genome. So there's no logical contradiction between sentence D and the sentence at the top. Therefore, our answer is B. "75% of 1,218 Americans surveyed did not want insurance companies to know their genetic code. Which one of the following is entailed by this proposition?" Now remember, for any of these sentences to be entailed by the proposition above, it must be the case that if that proposition above is true, this sentence cannot be false. So we'll ask about A. The majority of Americans surveyed want to share their genetic code with insurance companies. If it's entailed by the proposition above, then it should be true that if the proposition at the top is true, then A cannot be false. But it actually seems here that if the proposition above is true, A must be false, because the proposition on the top essentially tells us that the majority of Americans surveyed don't want to share their genetic code with insurance companies, where the proposition A tells us that the majority of Americans surveyed do want to share their genetic code with insurance companies. And so if the proposition at the top is true, then proposition A must be false, and therefore can't be entailed by it. Okay. B says 80% of the 1,218 Americans surveyed did not know what a genetic code is. Can that be false if the proposition at the top is true? Well, of course it can, right? These two things have nothing to do with each other. C says 85% of the 1,218 Americans surveyed do not have insurance. This is also not entailed by the proposition at the top, because this can be false even if the proposition at the top is true. D says more than half of 1,218 Americans surveyed did not want insurance companies to know their genetic code. Well, 75% of 1,218 Americans surveyed is more than half. And so if it's true that 75% of 1,218 Americans surveyed did not want insurance companies to know their genetic code, then it must also be true that more than half of 1,218 Americans surveyed did not want insurance companies to know their genetic code. Therefore, D is entailed by the proposition on the top. If the proposition at the top is true, D must also be true. Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad was charged in the suit with conducting genetic testing on employees without their permission. Which one of the following sentences entails this proposition? Now this is the reverse. If one of these following sentences entails the proposition at the top, then it's the case that if any of these sentences below is true, the proposition at the top must be true. Or in other words, if any of these sentences below is true, the proposition at the top cannot be false, otherwise there would be a self-contradiction. So we'll have to test whether that's the case in each of these sentences. A says Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad was charged in the suit with conducting genetic testing on employees without informing them. If it's the case that it was charged in the suit with conducting genetic testing on employees without informing them, it must also be the case that they were charged with conducting genetic testing on employees without their permission, because you can't get permission from someone for something without informing them about what it is that you're asking permission for. Therefore, if A is true, then the sentence at the top must also be true, and therefore sentence A entails the sentence at the top. If you look at the other three, you can see why that's not the case with regard to them. For example, in the case of B, It might be the case that Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad was conducting genetic testing on employees without their permission, and yet at the same time not charged in any lawsuit for that. So B can be true without the sentence at the top being true, and so B doesn't entail that. Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad was charged in the suit with conducting genetic testing on employees. That can also be true without their having been charged in the suit with conducting genetic testing on employees without their permission. These are two different things. And then the last one, Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad was charged in a lawsuit. It could have been charged in a lawsuit of any sort and not necessarily a suit for conducting genetic testing on employees without their permission. And so D could also be true without the sentence at the top being true. Since the only one here, which, if true, means that the sentence at the top cannot be false, is sentence A. Sentence A is the one which entails that proposition. So here we practiced 3 of the 10 exercises for the second unit of week 2. Go on and try the remaining 7, and then check yourself and watch for what you're being asked for, and be careful that you have a clear idea in mind about what the question is asking you for, and that you read every sentence carefully and interpret its meaning with care and precision, and then select your answer.